Good afternoon. Welcome to the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. I'm Dr. Kevin. I am Dr. Kevin Butterfield. That's not what I was about to say, but I'm the director of the Kluge Center, and we're pleased to have you here today to talk about an important element of the history of the United States Congress. While that institution that still exists today obviously is the same one that met for the first time in 1789, a great deal has changed across its history. The way that many members are elected, the types of people elected, the ways the bills are considered have all evolved significantly in the nearly 250 years since the inception of the Congress. And there may be no better way to look at these changes than through the House Committee on Rules, which dates back to 1789, but which would take decades to become one of those powerful committees in Congress as it is today. So we're joined today by Brianna Gray, Sarah Bender, both political scientists who focus on Congress and policymaking, who are going to talk with the Kluge Center's Andrew Breiner about the rules that shape the way Congress works and the ways that Congress shapes those rules. Brianna Gray is assistant professor in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. She's done a great deal of work researching the role of special rules and the Rules Committee in the House, and is currently working on a book on that topic. She was a 2021 Article I Fellow here at the Kluge Center. We're very glad to have her back here today. Sarah Bender is Professor of Political Science at George Washington University and Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. She specializes in Congress and legislative politics, as well as Congress's relationship with the Federal Reserve. In her many books on Congress, she's written on the topics of filibusters, partisanship, legislative gridlock, and more. Sarah Bender was also the 2020 chair in American Law and Governance here at the Kluge Center. So we're very glad to have her back as well for a discussion featuring Kluge Center alumni. I'll turn it over to Andrew to begin the discussion once you join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Thanks, Brianna. Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to start this off by asking if you can give us some context for the early decisions that Congress made about how to organize themselves and the challenges they faced in doing that.
Yeah, so I can start. I think one of the things we should really be thinking about when we talk about the organization of Congress is the environment of protecting freedoms. They're escaping a sort of constitutional monarchy, and they're thinking about autocracy and protections from it in the first iterations of Congress. And so Article I, when we think about the priorities that are being set in the Constitutional Convention, but also in the first Congresses, they're looking to Article I and the establishment of Article I to protect some of those freedoms. And I think it's not a coincidence that Article I comes first in the Constitution. I think the way that members of Congress sort of envisioned and the framers sort of envisioned how Congress its significance would be to focus on enumerating some of those priorities and highlighting the significance of this branch in the trifecta of government. So I think Article I really gives us a clear vision of how the framers prioritized Congress and thought through what its organizational structure would look like.
Sure. The only thing I would add is you think about those first members who came and served in the first House and the Senate, and that a large number of them had already served in the Confederation Congress under the Articles of Confederation. And the reason to keep that in mind is that the rules of the game in that Congress, and it was there was no separation of powers, as it were. There was no separate executive, but the rules were not conducive to getting much done. There were a lot of supermajority rules. It took 9 out of 12 colonies and then states in order to raise taxes. The internal rules on when you offer amendments and in what order were a little crazy in retrospect. And so the point in Article I, Section 5, right, that the House and Senate shall write their own rules was really, really, really fundamental to saying to the new Congress, you have the right here to actually create a functioning Congress. And so despite what many of us think, perhaps, that the Senate was designed to be this slow-moving, creaky thing that looks like a bunch of turtles in love with supermajority rules, no, they experienced that in the Confederation Congress. And so giving them the power in the first Congress to write their own rules, really, I think, pretty fundamental for thinking about how the Senate and the House had the capacity to evolve over time.
I see. And what types of people were these early members and representatives, and how has that changed today?
Yeah. One thing I wanted to add to the last question is to talk about some of the tensions that existed as a result of the federalism versus anti-federalism sort of spat, and thinking through the ways that some members were really centralized or focused on a strong central government. But then there were many who believed in the powers and the authorities of the states and empowering states to be able to run the federal government. One of the ways that we see this spat sort of play out is through a landmark Supreme Court case in McCullough versus Maryland, where we really see the Supreme Court focus on granting the central government or the federal government the responsibility and the ability to dictate and to sort of give context to what their authorities will be in relation to states. So I think really looking at that tension between federalism and anti-federalism in the first iterations of Congress is important to understand the context as well. And then with regard to your second question about the composition of Congress, I study this with some of my students. We see that the first sort of iterations of Congress tended to have an educated class. There were particularly men. We know that they were men. We know that they were white men. But we also know some of the facets of their backgrounds. 22 of them were lawyers. 11 of them were businessmen, merchants, and shippers. They were men of faith. There was very little racial, ethnic diversity. So this sort of colors the attention that's being paid to the policies and the rules that perhaps they are pushing forward. But also I think there's one other thing, and I don't want to talk too long, but this focus on turnover in Congress. It's really in sort of the modern context do we think about career politicians. In the earlier Congresses, we see that members serve maybe 1 to 2 terms, and then they turn the authority or the power over to another member. So they didn't really have this notion of seniority or careerism as a politician in the earlier context of Congress.
The only thing I would add is just to think about how small the electorates were in this period because of property, the requirement that you own properties, right, set by the states. So something like Virginia, I think the number is something like 5% of Virginia residents were enabled to vote. And so that, of course, has consequences when we think about members and who they're looking back home to, right? And to keep in mind that there were no electoral parties sending in the form that we have them decades later.
Right. And so you started getting at this a little bit in the answer to the first question, but what are the origins of rules in Congress, and how did the establishment of rules help to shape congressional operations?
I have a Thomas Jefferson quote that really, I think, gives context to that really well. Here we are. And he says, whether these forms, i.e. rules, be in all cases the most rational or not, is not really of so great importance. It is much more material that there should be a rule to go by than what the rule actually is. That there may be a uniformity of proceeding in business, not subject to the caprice of the speaker or captiousness of the members. It is very material that order, decency, and regularity be preserved in a dignified public body. And so in this statement, he's really saying that, it may not be as critical for us to get the rule right initially, right? We may have time to massage and to sort of rethink the rule in its best form, but it's super important that we have rules to begin with. And so I think I would highlight the fact that that's where we begin in how framers are thinking about rules, but also, the fact that we should be revisiting what these rules look like in the future.
I think that I would just add, I'll try to come up with my own Thomas Jefferson quote, because he wrote a manual of parliamentary practice. Well, the only thing I recall from that very long, involved manual is he makes the point that this isn't the end of the rules, that we will continue to take them up and they will change over time. But one thing to add to the broader context of what does it mean by when we mean by rules, certainly thinking in the House, but also to some degree in the Senate as well, right? If you open up, I guess people don't really open up. If you had the House Rules Manual on your shelf and it was your prized possession, because the Senate one is kind of small, you open it up, there's the Constitution first, and just to keep in mind the ways in which that structures things. So the 40 billion questions I was asked this week about recess appointments, the first stop is actually the Constitution. So thinking about what all sorts of stuff. So Constitution, Jefferson's Manual shows up in the rules, the rule book as well, and kind of put a bracket on why that's there. There's also this notion of general parliamentary law, which is what the House is under until they elect a speaker. And then, of course, the actual formal, what we call the standing rules, and then precedents, right? The interpretations of the rules, because rules can't, we don't know how a rule applies in every single circumstance. So it's just like and those all get built up, some from the get-go, and others get built up over time. And so there's, on the one hand, a lot of dense rules, provide some incentive for people who know the rules to give them some advantage, and lots of ways in which access to these rules and precedents evolve as well over time.
Yeah, as I hear, there was some humility about these initial rules among the people in these early Congresses, but what were the kinds of rules that they were considering implementing? Can you give us some examples or some idea of what they were thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were certainly thinking about quorum and what it means to be representative of a particular policy and to push a policy without having the requisite number of people there who are in support of a policy. I also think they were thinking about the legislative calendar. You know, this is an earlier iteration or imagination of what Congress looked like, and so people had to travel for some time to get to DC, and so, you know, that makes a big influence on how they structured the congressional calendar. I also think, you know, when we talk about the earlier vision of Congress, it was roughly like 55 to 65 members, so it's a really small body. And, you know, we know it now to be much larger than that, right? But I do think the organization of work was also something that they were thinking about. Who was going to be, how they were going to divvy up the responsibilities. We see, you know, in the 1800s, the early 1800s, where the expansion of the role of the speaker, but also the expansion of the role of committees through Henry Clay was something that was focused specifically on. They were growing as a society, they were growing as a country with more constituents, and so they really had to organize the division of labor and the issue areas that members were focusing on.
The one thing to add here is I think sometimes it's tempting to look at a rule book and certainly the first ones and to say that, wow, these rules are allocating power in the institution, and we can compare the House and Senate and how power was allocated. But I think it's important to step back and to think that what the rules really are doing, they are allocating parliamentary rights, right? They don't endow power; they provide advantages in the rules and some disadvantages, but it's up to the members and the leaders to figure out, like, how are you going to use these allocations of parliamentary rights that you've been given. And then just one other thing to keep in mind, if you look at the first House and Senate rules, well, it took the Senate, of course, it took them like 4 or 5 months to show up, so whatever. Can we say that on this side of the hill? I don't know. But the House and Senate rules were pretty similar. They weren't identical, but they're pretty similar, right? In a part because they're drawing from the House of Commons, they're drawing from what would eventually be Jefferson's Manual, and drawing a little bit from state legislatures and so forth. So there's far more commonality across the two chambers than what we see today, where they've really gone, in many ways, different directions.
Thanks, Sarah. You reminded me of something else, which is that, you know, one of the elephants in the room is that the Rules Committee started not as a standing committee. It was a select committee where Congress would summon it, and then it would be disbanded probably before the congressional session ended. And so they would create sort of a pocket of rules for the Congress to follow, but they wouldn't continue their operations through the year. It wasn't until 1883 when we see sort of the role of the Rules Committee change and become a standing committee and have some of those powers that we know that it has today.
Well, it sounds like you've already started on this, but what were the origins of the House Committee on Rules, and what were its initial responsibilities?
Yeah, so I think similar to something that I just talked about, which is, you know, thinking about the enshrinement of the Rules Committee and the focus on rules as a priority in Congress. So transitioning from that sort of temporary role to something that's more stable and has more continuity is sort of the first way to think about the Rules Committee. I think the second way to think about it is when you start to see the role of the speaker evolve. The first sitting speaker to serve on the Rules Committee was William Pennington, and we really see the sort of scope and role and responsibilities of the Rules Committee expand at that time. The Speaker is using the Rules Committee as a weapon or a tool for strategic advantage and to advance the legislative agenda. And I really do think that the role of rules sort of evolved as we see the relationship between the Speaker and the Rules Committee evolve.
So the Rules Committee, just to put it in context, when Speaker Reed goes onto the committee and then later becomes Speaker, he's on the Rules Committee, and it's 1880. They're doing a renovation, it's kind of a landmark renovation of the rules. And it's his, think about it, we're in a period sort of like today, which is kind of tight electoral competition. Fairly, we're 2 decades past the Civil War, so the Democratic South has been reborn. Pretty tight electoral competition, and on measures of polarization and partisanship, pretty partisan. And there seems to be an incentive, largely spearheaded by Reed as a rank and file member, to give more power to the majority party. That the rules of the game hadn't sufficiently fine-tuned who can control the agenda and who can block off minority obstruction. It wasn't sufficiently, in Reed's mind, sufficiently endowing the majority party with power. And so you begin to see it then in 1880. It's the origins of what we call these special rules or resolutions, where you can go to the floor with a rule from the Rules Committee that says we will debate at 2 p.m., there'll be 6 amendments and so forth, very structuring of the agenda to advance what the majority party might have wanted. So you get to see a kind of major landmark kind of break there at that juncture.
And so, did you have?
No,
Okay,
I mean,
yeah. So we've been talking about institutions, and as we know, institutions are made of people, and we've also talked about a couple of individuals recently who've shaped the institution. How did the sort of individual personalities of members play into the evolving nature of this committee?
Yeah, I think Dr. Bender brought up a really good point, which is Reed's rules. These really revolutionized how we think about the majority party and their role in sort of structuring the congressional order and the operational function of Congress. So, one of the reasons for this was because of the disappearing quorum and the fact that, it was very difficult for the majority at that time to get to a quorum to be able to do their congressional business. So one, for sure, Thomas Reed in, establishing the Reed's rules to protect sort of that disappearing quorum, but also the right of non-recognition. That's really one of the biggest, I think, aspects of Reed's rules, which is the fact that, a speaker can choose not to recognize someone on the House floor if they believe that perhaps there is some deleterious reason that this person is trying to engage. And I think that's one of the reasons we were able to see Reed's rules sort of take form.
So Reed is about 1890, 1891. He's going through this, as you said, to these procedural moves to kill the ability of the minority party to show up on the floor, but then refuse to answer the quorum call. And at that point, the speaker and the clerk weren't allowed to count you present if you didn't answer the speaker. And so it was the disappearing quorum. And if in a tight majority, just like today, no more disappearing quorums. Thank you, Speaker Reed. But in a time, you can imagine what more difficulties Speaker McCarthy and Speaker Johnson would have had if there could be a disappearing quorum. But at the moment of when he tells the clerk to count all the people who hadn't answered, which wasn't in the rules or the precedents, this House member from Kentucky stands up. There's a point to this story, I swear. Breckinridge from Kentucky stands up and he says, "Mr. Speaker, I deny you the right to count me," which is, for us Congress folks, this is like the most exciting, one of those memorable lines. So imagine, it's 1993, I'm sitting in the library at Brookings, and one of my colleagues, who shall go nameless, comes down and he says, "Hey, Sarah, I just got my brochure from this is also archaic, the History Book of the Month Club contest. There's a little pamphlet every month that came, and there's a trivia question." And so a unnamed colleague, because I don't want to embarrass him, comes in and says, "Who said this? Mr. Speaker, I deny you the right to count me." I'm like, "John Breckinridge, 1890 House floor." He goes, "Great, I'm going to enter it into the contest." I was like, "This is great." And so he mails it away. And then he comes back a couple months later because it's snail mail. And he says, "Hey, good news." I was like, "What?" "We won." I'm like, "What do you mean, we won? What do you mean, we won?" He goes, we won. You gave me the answer and I entered it. I was like, well, what did we win? He goes, we won $25. I think, did we each win 25? Or are you telling me? Are you telling me that my dissertation, which was about the rules, is worth $12.50? He said yes.
Is that how you split the money?
Yes, that is how I split the money. And it's very sad. It is very sad.
I agree.
And it's
It
not
doesn't
like
seem quite fair.
Yeah. I think an attention being paid to Henry Clay is also worth mentioning in this conversation, especially with regard to his vision to expand the committee system. So from 1811 to 1825, we see that the number of committees increased from 10 to 26. And so that's a really big expansion of the responsibilities of committees. But then we also see the way that sort of counteracts in future iterations of committees when we see the relationship between a strong committee and a strong leadership, that tension sort of evolve in Congress.
So it seems to me that the importance of these rules comes to the fore when there is a time of great sort of ideological difference and dispute. So what are some kind of examples you can give of when that exactly has happened in the past, when there was like a lot of ideological division?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Sure. So this is like the greatest thing, and I don't know if there's like a one-to-one connection, but at moments of great changes in the rules, it's usually pushed for a policy reason, right? The coalition comes together because they want to get something done, but they can't because the rules are blocking them. Mm-hmm. So civil rights, late 19th century, there were 1 or 2 episodes where even right in a lame duck session where the majority knows they've lost the election, they're going to be the minority, they do something to make it easier for the majority to get that bill on the floor. And they do it because civil rights is so important to that Republican majority at the time. So you see it other civil rights battles, certainly in the Senate, that confluence of civil rights and rule changes. The House, there was a kind of to-do about the size of the Rules Committee in 1961, and Kennedy, basically, John F. Kennedy kind of commandeered the Speaker to expand the Rules Committee so that Southern conservatives from the Democratic Party wouldn't have such a stranglehold, again, to push his agenda on civil rights. So again, that nexus, because rules themselves, people's eyes glaze, our eyes don't glaze over, but people's, and many of your eyes don't glaze over, but many eyes do glaze over. So if you want to build a coalition, you need to have like some motivating factor that the public can understand.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I think another example would be the Cannon Revolt in 1910, when we see Speaker Cannon sort of ousted from his committee leadership positions and also the speakership, and the fact that, you know, there's this tension between having really strong committee heads and a strong speaker, and we see in that iteration and that example that committees were not happy with having central governance in the speakership. So we really see rules being used as a tactic to sort of unseat this really powerful speaker.
And how, if at all, has the legislative process for turning a bill into law changed since earlier periods in Congress's history?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that the Rules Committee has expanded in terms of its size, but into its power and responsibilities. It's arguably one of the top 5 most significant committees in Congress today. And so the fact that, you know, a number of bills are first routed through the Rules Committee. Dr. Bender mentioned earlier that there are these special rules that many bills sort of have to be assigned in order to move through the legislative process. And that is something that was foreign to earlier Congresses, right? Thinking about the role of open versus really closed rules, that dictates how well and how easily a bill can get through to the House floor. And that is, you know, something that was very uncommon and didn't exist in earlier Congresses.
The other, I guess, more general change here, of course, as we've sort of been talking about, is certainly in the House, a set of procedural changes in the early 19th century that put the House on a path towards majority rule and empowering if your majority party is cohesive, it allows a party to advance its agenda and its policy in the form that it wants, and to preclude minority party or opposition or even cross-party coalitions at times from getting a vote on amendments in the floor. So, and that wasn't from the get-go. That's part of the evolution. Make one rule, and then you use that rule to get other rules changes that you want. And so you end up with this remarkably partisan, if a party wants to use it that way, but majoritarian House even by the early 20th century after Reed. In contrast to the Senate, which really goes, even though they started with essentially the same rules, they go in the opposite direction, become really this chamber of individual rights and obstruction and partisan obstruction, so that obstruction is no longer the single guy on the floor. It's 41 senators unwilling to stop debate.
Considering some of the unprecedented procedural moments in contemporary Congresses, do you think Congress still has a built-in system of checks and balances? And when do we see them employed, and are they effective?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should trust in the system that has been built. I started this by talking about Article 1 and I was going to reference Article 2 as well, but, you know, if you look at the documents, if you look at the text of the Constitution, each of the branches are mentioned, you know, across each of the mentionings, right? So in Article 1, we see a connection to Article 2. In Article 2, we see that the president has a responsibility to report to Congress, right? The State of the Union, we see that. The Congress has a role in shaping elections and calling for when elections are scheduled to take place. And so I think there is a relationship that provides this check and balance that's etched in our constitutional framework. So I do think that we still are going to really be looking at the role of the way that these institutions sort of work together and how they play a check and a balance on one another.
I guess I worry a little bit about whether, I mean, I only study Congress because it's Article 1, as you said, is the first one. But I do worry that the stronger presidencies get, the harder and harder it is for Congress and lawmakers to stand up for the prerogatives of their institution. And I hadn't anticipated that within 4 or 5 days of the election, we'd be back to the same question we were asked for 4 years straight, right? Can he do that? Can Trump do that? And this time is, can he send the Senate home and do recess appointments for whatever he wants? If Republicans agree to do that, what that really means is the Senate has just abdicated, just completely abdicated what is in the Constitution that gives them the right and the authority. They don't have to exercise it, as we know sometimes they don't, but to do advice and to vet and to poke under the closets and so forth, and bank accounts in every which way, to look at nominations, and then to be the ones to decide up or down on whether they should be confirmed. If they give in on the recess appointments, it's constitutional, but it would be a little warning sign of the sort of chipping away of lawmakers' willingness to stand up for the kind of procedures of their and the rights of the institution.
I think just one thing to add to that would be the way that our members of Congress are elected. They're elected through a democratic process. So constituents are the ones who are choosing who's going to be their representative. And I think that's another system of checks that the framers sort of thought about, in that, you know, we're absolving the Congress of this responsibility and putting it on the people. Mm-hmm. We're allowing the people to sort of pick and choose who they think is appropriate for representing them, and if they've done a good job or not. I think that's also evidenced by the fact that every 2 years we have the opportunity to re-elect or select a different candidate for the House, and every 6 years for the Senate. But I do think that provides a good check and balance. I agree with Dr. Bender that, you know, it does concern us when we see sort of a central way that the executive branch is sort of consolidating power and providing strategic hurdles for the Congress to do its business. But I do think that we should trust in, one, the power of the people to elect members of Congress to do their job, and two, the fact that our Constitution shapes and sort of guides us in how we think about what they're tasked with doing.
Yeah, so some of the talk about sort of recent political events leads me to my next question. You know, it's been a very popular thing to sort of say that ideological divisions are sort of at their highest or most extreme. It's sort of it's popularly believed, I would say, in the past decades and maybe even right now. But how would you compare current ideological divisions in Congress to those in these periods that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's really a tough, I think that's a tough assessment to make. Are we more divided now than we were in the past? I think there's a different type of division. If you look at some of the research on this, we're seeing that members of Congress are operating in their sort of own echo chambers, and there's a lot less bipartisan co-sponsorship. There are fewer examples of legislation that people support from both conservative and liberal perspectives. And I don't think that when we look at earlier Congresses, we see that. But I do think that there are ways that coalitions have been built in the contemporary Congress that may not be something that we would have imagined. If you look at the ways that the current election and the current moment of the election happened, you see that some of the coalitions that were really leaned into were successful, and they may not have been something that we would have imagined.
Yeah, I mean, so political scientists like to measure stuff. And the advantage of measuring stuff is you can get claims of these sort of general long-term trends and then try to make a sense of where you are today. And the disadvantage, of course, is that sometimes measures obscure differences, as you've been pointed to. If we do it on the sort of the measures we use for ideological differences, with the caveat that sometimes we call it ideological polarization, but it's just partisanship. Oftentimes it's team play. Your team's for it, so my team's against it, and then 5 years later, oh, your team's on the other side of the question, and now so I'm on the other side. Right. So, but that is division as well. But if you look over the long haul, today, both in the House and the Senate, kind of record levels of what we call polarization, akin to the late 19th century. But I think what is startling is if you look at those types of measures, mid 20th century, Great New Deal up and through the Great Society, up until 80s, 90s when we get a Republican revolution. That's the unusual part. Those are very ideologically diverse parties. So the Democratic Party had liberals on the far left, and they had segregationists on the far right. Republicans had, we don't even have the term anymore, they had liberal Republicans from New York and so forth, all the way to conservative Republicans. We don't have parties like that, and so that major change is certainly like the big current here, which makes people wonder, like, do we ever go back to that type of ideological ferment in the parties? But I don't know.
Do you have an answer to that?
The last time I made a prediction, and I'm sticking with this, the last time I made a prediction was actually November 8th, 2016, and I've not made one since, mostly because the 20 non-political science friends in my house who came over for dinner to watch the election results are still not talking to me.
Understand.
Half joke.
So what would you say are some of the most pivotal moments in the history of congressional rulemaking, kind of going back to some of these periods, and what's their significance today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things we should be thinking about are Reed's rules and how obviously that made a huge difference in quorum, ensuring that you find a quorum. I think the role of an expansion of committees has certainly been an example of rulemaking and the ways that reshape the organizational structure of Congress and the function. I also think when we look at the Legislative Reorganization Acts, the one in 1946, but also the one in 1970, we see, how Congress, in looking at a snapshot, decided, okay, we need either more committees, we need fewer committees, we need more procedures, we need less procedures. And this, I think, back to Dr. Bender's point, which is that, it's contingent upon people, it's contingent upon who is sort of in the majority party and what their priorities are in accomplishing their agenda. So I definitely think that, when you look at Reed's rules, when you look at some of the examples in history like 1910 Cannon Revolt, and when you look at some of the restructuring of Congress, you see sort of snapshots of when rule changes have made a difference in the operational structure of Congress.
Well, political scientists and historians and others disagree about what I'll give you is my interpretation of I think the most pivotal moment, but that's okay. In this room, we can agree that I'm correct because they're not here. Just kidding. I'm open to their interpretations. But to my view, the single most important thing that has affected, it did happen in the Senate, but affects obviously policymaking generally, is getting away with the one rule that might have enabled a more majoritarian system, is what we call today the previous question motion. And we don't need to go into all the history there, but if we look at the House today, you want to cut off debate, majority votes, moves the previous question, and debate is over. The Senate had that rule in 1789, and it had some mixed uses. It wasn't really clear how it worked, but just like the House, who improved their version of the rule, the Senate could have used their version of the rule and become a more majoritarian institution. But my favorite vice president, Aaron Burr, presiding over the Senate before he had to get out of town for reasons you might imagine, 1805, gave advice on the rule book before he left. He said, you should clean up this messy rule book. You're a great body, but your rules are bad. And he singles out the previous question motion. He says, it just postpones measures, because remember, they hadn't figured out how to use it. And so in 1806, clean up the rule book, and it's gone, right? Not because the Senate loves debate, not because the Senate wanted free deliberation and wanted filibusters, but because Aaron Burr told him to clean up the rule book. And that stops short the building of majority rule in the Senate. It takes decades to get a cloture rule to cut off debate early 20th century. And then, as we've seen, like chipping away at majority rule, although still, obviously, you can filibuster. But that changed, today, in today's Congress, is really the stopping point for a lot of sort of partisan new electoral majorities coming in and putting the brakes on them.
I see. Yeah. And can you describe how the framers of the U.S. Constitution might have envisioned the relationship between Congress and the president, and what their reaction might be to observing that relationship today?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think, today we see sort of a perhaps extreme case of what the founders may not have envisioned, right? Which is a consolidation of executive branch authorities that may sort of supersede some of the original enumerated privileges. I've been thinking a lot about, how Congress and the president will work together, or perhaps not be able to work together. And I think, one of the answers to this question is to look at the division of labor in Congress. The fact that, the House introduces bills, but also the Senate introduces bills, but there has to be some reconciliation there. So I do think that when we talk through some of the questions about the relationship between the president and Congress, the fact that there are so many potential veto points sort of give me hope and give me encouragement that we're thinking about continuity of operations, but also thinking about how, leaning on rules, and back to that Thomas Jefferson quote, leaning on rules as a way to guide us through unprecedented times is something that we can feel encouraged and a little bit lighter about.
I think there was and again, I'll massacre the Federalist Papers, but this notion that, how do you get the checks and balances to work? Well, we're going to make ambition to counter ambition. And then there's a line in the Federalist Papers about connecting the interests of the man to the interests of the place, the rights and responsibilities of the place. But the framers of the Constitution, certainly the framers, not even the Federalist Papers, really, they don't really tell us how do you make that work? How do you get people to connect what they want and their interests to what they can do, from where they sit and what those responsibilities and rights are, right? And so that's the perennial issue you see as Congress and American politics has become so partisan, the worry that your commitment is to your party, and thus, if you're a member, to the president, and not as your responsibilities or your potential as lawmakers. How much oversight gets done? Well, less so when your party controls, unified party control, right? Because there are partisan incentives not to be tough. And we can see that play out in other ways. There are just very few ways in which lawmakers seem willing to stand up for the responsibilities of the institution.
Right. And I think this will be our last question from me before we go to audience questions. So think about your questions, please. Can you describe? What can the history of Congress tell us about the future direction of Congress?
Well, in looking at some of the really tense moments that we've been talking about in Congress, knowing that there have been rules and procedures that have helped to guide those moments is encouraging. And I think, seeing how members of Congress have stood up and have chosen to really counter some of the challenges that these, congressional sessions have experienced is heartening. And so, in looking at history, I think that's a good way to show us that we can get through divisiveness, we can get through polarization in ways, that, may not provide sort of sweeping progress, right? We may not see huge changes that are made, but we can sort of tiptoe our way through this process. And I think that's heartening. I think history gives us a really good indicator of being able to move through challenging, polarized, really hostile times.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is it was very nicely put. The only thing I would add is think about where we started with talking about the makeup of the Congress, white men, wealthy men, and to think about the enormous demographic changes and ethnic changes that have, and gender changes that have occurred in both bodies, right? There's just this reminder that Congress does change, or does respond to the electoral world around it. Maybe not as fast, and for some people too fast, as the world changes around it, but it's not possible for Congress to just ignore what's going on for all these representational reasons that Brianna pointed to. So in that sense, right, if you're trying to think what happens next, it's good to take account of the ways in which and the conditions under which lawmakers have incentives to change something about their institution, and then find these coalitions, put these coalitions together, even if they don't care about the same things, but become this common carrier for trying to make change.
I see. Thanks. All right, so if you're watching on Zoom, please put questions in the Q&A function. If you're here, please raise a hand and someone will bring you a microphone. Sure, go ahead.
Thank you.
No, just give it a second.
Like now? Okay. Thank you. That was really illuminating and interesting. Two committees that in the past had a pretty big impact were the Hunger Committee and the Children, Youth, and Families Committee. And I wonder if you could talk about how that kind of committee came and went, why it's different, and what happened in those two instances. Or can you? I don't know this history.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with this history, but I think we do see moments where Congress finds reasons to add committees. Maybe the conditions, I think we've talked a little bit about the state of the electorate and public policy needs. And so I do think we see sort of the expansion of committees, subcommittees, right? That wasn't a thing in the first iterations of Congress. But I do think that the policy needs of constituents sort of shape and reshape the needs in, the focuses in Congress. So I'm not as familiar with those committees, but I do think Congress sort of tends to dictate, and the Speaker and leadership tend to dictate, okay, what do we need to prioritize? We've seen committees pop up and perhaps not be as focused on in other Congresses.
That's an awesome answer.
Is that, let me be more specific, sorry. One, the Hunger Committee was Mickey Leland, the rather well-known congressman of that era, killed in a plane crash, sadly, while trying to carry out the work of that committee. The other was George Miller chaired, the deputy of Nancy Pelosi, and I think they were both select committees, right? Do you guys? No, don't know. Okay. So these, okay, maybe I can change this differently. What is the chairman of the Rules Committee, what is the possibility of that job in allowing these committees to be continued, reinvented, whatever?
Well, because committees get written into rules, or maybe written even as a select committee with a timeline to expire, right, the January 6th committee or so forth, that's a decision of the whole House, less so a matter of where the Rules Committee is, even though the rules get proposed by, invented by the Rules Committee that then go to the House. But not a lot gets done at that level without the imprimatur of the speaker and the leadership, certainly in today's Congress. So you pointed to important ones on hunger, youth, and families. We can think to more recent ones, well, certainly, I guess, January 6th, but also ones, the climate change. I think the Pelosi speaker had a climate change select committee. So even something intelligence started in the wake of all the CIA scandals in the 1970s. It still, I think, has that select committee, but of course it's Congress, so now it's called the Permanent Select Committee. So I don't know, but it does seem to be a way, rather than going through a step that might generate opposition, to create a standing committee, because there is a standing committee that has jurisdiction over children and health and families. But this is a way to respond in the moment when you're not going to be able to grab jurisdiction from the existing committee, but to create it and give it a space and give it some prominence so it holds a hearing, even often if it has no legislative authority to report a bill. So my hunch is it's something like that dynamic that's generating the push.
Thank you. I'll keep talking until it works as well. Is it working? Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you. This has been a fantastic presentation. I've really enjoyed it. The nature of the rules of the House have changed significantly over the last 200 and something years. In the way that power has been exercised, it seems like there's like periods of stability and then there's periods of change where you have one system and then there's another system and there's another system, whether it's centralized power in the Speaker or in the Rules Committee or elsewhere. In the last couple of years, we've seen efforts to go around the Rules Committee a little bit with the appropriations bills in particular. We've seen the stacking of the Rules Committee a little bit with putting members on there that you wouldn't see otherwise. And right now we're having votes on the Republican conference, right? That's coming up in terms of the conference rules. So I know predictions aren't happening that much in the last 8 years, but I'd be interested in what your thoughts are in terms of, it seems like the House might be in another period where it's starting to change again after a period of stability. And can you wipe off the crystal ball and like, what does it look like where we might be going next?
This is a heavy one.
It's not going to be me.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really difficult to imagine the next sort of generation of this committee. I think Sarah brought up, Dr. Bender brought up a really good point about demographic shifts and how, you know, in studying the Rules Committee, I've seen that the first woman, you know, the first set of women have become a part of the committee. We've seen the first people of color added to this committee. So I do think that that is something to note. And I think that has an effect on the type of priorities that they push and sort of the ways that they are thinking about their role in the broader context of Congress. I don't know that I have specifics about some of the like particular rule specialties that they want to push or focus on, but I am, I think, encouraged to know that, you know, because we've seen a change in sort of the demographics of the Rules Committee, and this is not just, you know, physically, but also ideologically, right? We've looked at sort of the spectrum of leanings, liberal, conservative, and I do think that there has been an array on the Rules Committee of these ideological leanings, and also thinking about geographic features of some of the members that are on the Rules Committee, right? We have members from really a wide array of places with different interests, right? So rural, urban, you know, really city-oriented people, but people that may, you know, be in farmland, right? And I think, you know, that diversity is helpful in thinking about the priorities and the policies that will be filtered through this committee to then get assigned special rules and then to reach potentially the House floor.
Okay, I'll make a prediction. So I think reversing or tampering or weakening centralization, I think it's hard. Mm-hmm. And think of it this way. The House and Senate have different constituencies. They have different electoral timelines. They have very different rules, and yet they've both moved towards centralization, right? They both become more partisan, more polarized, and there's more power given to party leaders. And at the same time, we see, like you sort of pointed to, like this chafing of House members, certainly from the Freedom Caucus in the guys, right, regular order, return to committees, little less heavy-handedness of the Rules Committee and the Speaker. The same thing if you're listening to the debates on this, on who's to be the Senate leadership, right? The right side of the caucus, of the conference, was saying, we don't have amendments anymore, which is true. There's no amendments. It gets shut down. And there are lots of reasons why we don't see much amending going on the Senate floor. But it's like, sure, there's this push to take some of, or pull to take some of that power back. But at the same time, leaders are listening to other rank and file members who want to be protected from having to take votes that put them in tough positions. They like the centralization. And so it's sort of like, what's a leader to do? We watched Speaker McCarthy. That was really hard on him. And we can fault the decisions he made, but it's hard to see another different outcome, and it didn't work out for him. So I think it's a tough call. I think it's hard to loosen the reins in a time where there's demands from outside the party, certainly organized interests, but also inside the chamber. Rank and file members want some leadership protection. They want certainty. They want to know when they're coming into work. They want to know when they're leaving. They have families at home. And that requires a little more heavy-handed monitoring of the agenda. And so not impossible to whittle it away, but I don't quite see it yet on either side, even though clearly we can see these factions in the party that might agree with each other to pull that back from the leaders. That was my prediction.
Hello, could you discuss the evolution of private laws or I guess a reduction in frequency of private laws during the history of Congress and the organization of Congress and operations? I'm thinking because I track copyright for Congressional Research Service, and I just was like, what's a private law? And so then and I was just curious about that.
I think I would have to get back to you on that. Yeah.
Likewise. It's probably good reason for it, but I'd rather not hazard a guess. But I think in part it has to, right, but the private laws were often pension demands and other. Yes. So, and I don't know precisely what, there may be diversity across the different types of private laws so that, some of those get encapsulated in more routine entitlements and so forth. But yeah, we need more time. I need to consult CRS.
Exactly.
Thank you for the presentation. And what caught my ear was when you were saying this is one of the most powerful committees in the House. Mm-hmm. And I know you all kind of talked a lot about inflection points and how it restructured the Congress. I wonder if you can maybe explain more about what's the power of this committee in the day-to-day operations or passing bills? I know you mentioned special rules. What are those kind of powers that it uses? And, what are some maybe notable examples of creating new special rules or new categories to maybe deal with bills, and just how are speakers leveraging that to get their agendas through, or if there's any friction between the chairman of the Rules Committee and the speaker when they're trying to push their agenda. So more of that day-to-day legislative operation.
Yeah, so a lot of the work that I do focuses on building data sets around the number of bills that are assigned special rules. And when you look at some of the stats on special rules, you see that about 80 to 90% of bills that are assigned special rules tend to make it to the House floor. We know that that's not the case for the 10,000 or so bills that are introduced in every Congress. And so there's something about a bill going through the Rules Committee that makes it particularly more likely that it would have legislative success. And so in thinking about how members are being strategic, it's an incentive for them to want to work with the Rules Committee to get something assigned a special rule. I do think, back to the point about this open to closed rules, we've seen almost no open rules in the past several Congresses, and that's sort of an indicator of how Congress feels about the rulemaking environment, how they feel perhaps about polarization and the stresses that they may have in trying to anticipate what will happen to their bill once it reaches the House floor. So I think that the Rules Committee provides sort of a safeguard in members' minds to protecting a bill from the various veto players and the various opportunities for bills to be killed either in committee or once they get to the House floor.
I guess I would add, right, if you're a leader and you want to achieve an outcome, right, in Congress, everybody has an equal vote. So I can't command you, if I'm speaker, I can't command you to vote some way, right? This is like the great John Boehner, who's on Jay Leno. In the middle, they just shut down the government, and he was still on Jay Leno. He was still the speaker. He says, he's talking about why he let his colleagues shut down the government. He said, I told them it was a bad idea, but they want to do it anyway. So he said, I just followed them as they went into their canyon and closed down the government by refusing to do spending bills. And he said, look, a leader without followers is just a man taking a walk, right? So leaders have to, they can't, that's like odes to great speakers of the past. But they can't command it. So what do they have an option? They could do like try to directly influence you, directly pressure. When I demonstrate this in class, like twisting arms, I once actually really hurt my arm, so I'm not actually going to demonstrate, like twisting arms. And there are a couple of celebrated instances where leaders might try to do that. But instead, what they really want to do is indirectly shape the agenda. They want to put the choices on the floor that are going to lead, oh, this is great. Oh, that's what the speaker wants. Oh, this is really bad. I don't want to vote for that one. They want to structure the agenda. And that's what the Rules Committee is doing for them, so long as they have influence over the nature of who's on that Rules Committee. Right? We call it the arm of the, what's with my arms today? We call it the arm of the leadership, right? Now it's 9 majority members, 4 minority members, right? And that's like, again, like what happened with Speaker McCarthy is to become speaker, he gave in to a demand from the right side of his conference to put 3 folks who were not party leader friendly onto the Rules Committee, which was kind of unheard of. So why? Because it limits, or it makes it challenging for the leader to use the Rules Committee to put the procedures on the floor, put the options on the floor that are more likely to lead to the outcome that leaders want. So, and leaders have gotten pretty creative about it. They have all fancy names: Queen of the Hill, King of the Hill. Everyone's got a little special rule. So I think that's why it commands so much attention from us.
And just one more thing that helped color something else that I thought about, which is, in an era where it's more difficult to project what Congress will do next, right? I think the Rules Committee provides really a snapshot of all of the priorities of leadership, of all the priorities, or many of the priorities of the majority party. And so I've heard Trevia Dean, who was a legislative director, once said, the Rules Committee is the best bird's eye view in Washington of what will happen sort of on the next home front for Congress. And I think looking at the Rules Committee in that way is really helpful and useful in thinking about its role today.
Thanks. All right, I think we're going to go to our last question from the online audience.
Yes, we have a question from Laura online. So, majority members of the Rules Committee voting against or voting down rules is a stark change we've seen in this Congress, especially with the historically weak speakerships of McCarthy and Johnson. How should we consider this in historical perspective, and what might happen to the Rules Committee next Congress, especially since the Speaker will have the same problems, i.e. small margins and an emboldened House Freedom Caucus?
Yeah. Do you want to start?
It could be an example here of Daniel's question of like fractures that are trying to lessen some of that authority that's been given to speakers to make it less centralized. And maybe that's like the breaking point here that might convince leadership to try to find ways to accommodate these demands. However, the more you accommodate the demands on one side, you got the faction on the other side, and now you have the president of your party leaning heavily on you to produce something that he wants. So I'm really bad at analogies. It's like canary in the coal mine. It's like a warning sign, but I don't know that the parties that we have today with their slim majorities, I don't know that it's a solvable in the immediate term for the Republican leadership.
All right, well, I think we'll close it there. Thank you so much to the audience for being here. And thank you, Dr. Brianna Gray and Dr. Sarah Bender, for being here today for a great discussion.
Thank
you so much.
Thanks.
you. And thanks. And if you're in person, please fill out a survey before leaving. We would really appreciate that. Thank you, everybody.